At 11:47 a.m., my wife handed me a sealed envelope and said that at noon, everything that was mine would cease to be mine. My hands were still covered in grease from the workshop when she walked in, dry-faced, her expression too tense for a normal conversation. There was no fight, no argument, just that restrained look, as if she had already been through everything I was about to experience. The envelope was heavy, but not because of what was inside. It was because of what it was about to rip from me. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She just looked at the wall clock and said, "You have 13 minutes. After that, the lawyer will have already read it." On the kitchen table, the paper seemed to tremble more than my hand. It wasn't the content that frightened me. It was her silence. It was what I didn't yet know, and what she had already decided. Up until that moment, I thought my life was in order. But that envelope, it wasn't just a warning. It was the sentence for something I didn't even know I was being judged for, and the clock kept ticking. And the worst was yet to come. My name is Daniel Whitmore. I'm 38 years old and I spend most of my days under cars fixing what others prefer to replace with new ones. I live in a simple neighborhood in Springfield, Ohio, the same city where I grew up, although for a long time I did everything I could to stay away from it. I own a small mechanic shop which I set up with savings from almost a decade working for others. No fortune, no secrets, just honest work, sweat accumulated on my hands, and the strange pleasure of seeing a dead engine breathe again. I never wanted much more than that. I never saw myself as someone who would compete for anything. I'm not one for conflict, I never have been. On weekends I mow the lawn. On cold nights I add more wood to the fireplace. I have 2 dogs that follow me everywhere, and a wife who, until that day, I swore I knew better than I knew myself. My name didn't appear in headlines. It wasn't adorned with golden plaques, and until that morning it wasn't mentioned in any wills either. The only legacy I accepted to carry was that of surviving in silence, but somehow, it seems that even that is at risk now. I grew up in a house that was too big for so much absence. My father wasn't the type to yell, but his silence weighed more than any scolding. He had a presence but no commitment. He was there physically, but never truly. Every time I tried to get closer, he recoiled as if my affection were an inconvenient reminder of something he didn't want to face. In my childhood, I quickly learned that attention was something earned through merit, not affection. But no matter how hard I tried, what I did was never enough. My report cards would disappear under the pile of reports in his office. And the drawings I left on his desk, and he would turn into crumpled paper in the corner trash can. My mother? She smiled in Christmas photos. She'd say, "Everything will be all right," in a voice too sweet to be sincere. But when he raised his voice, she'd lower her eyes. When he slammed the door, she'd pretend it wasn't her. She wouldn't slam it with me, but she never defended me either. The only one who truly saw me was my maternal grandmother, Eileen. A small woman with hands always busy and eyes too attentive to ignore what lay behind the walls. She taught me to take care of the simple things, to wash my own clothes, to respect what I planted, not to return evil with the same weight. It was from her that I first heard that a real man doesn't measure his worth by the name on the wall, but by the dignity with which he goes through life. It was also with her that I experienced one of the scenes that marked me the most. It was my 12th birthday. I waited all night for my father to return. Sitting on the porch steps with a piece of cake kept on a paper plate, the candle had already melted when my grandmother sat down beside me, handed me a present wrapped in newspaper and said, "You won't get what you wanted, but you'll get what you need." It was an old wrench worn out, not even pretty, but it was there that she taught me how to fix the hinge on the door of the old shed in the back. That became my refuge. While inside they discussed money and appearances, I learned to build silence with a purpose. And perhaps that's why today, when things threaten to collapse, I remain silent as well, because that's how I survived. I left that house at 18, no screaming, no goodbyes, just a small bag and the promise to never again depend on anyone who looked at me with obligation. I didn't leave out of anger. I left out of necessity. The emptiness inside was so heavy that if I had stayed, it would have swallowed me whole. Since then, my life has been built slowly, piece by piece, relationship by relationship, everything with great care, so as not to repeat the mistakes that created me. But now, looking at that envelope in my hand, I realized that what I buried 20 years ago was back. And worse, it came with my name at the top and the signature of the man who never called me son at the bottom. The morning after the envelope arrived, I received a call I wasn't expecting and, frankly, never wanted. "Daniel, this is Cynthia." The voice was too soft for what was coming from behind. "We wanted to see you. There are a few things we need to sort out before the official reading." Cynthia Whitmore, my father's second wife. Officially my stepmother in practice, a woman who always made a point of making it clear that I was a silent nuisance in the scene she called family. She suggested a discreet cafe, in a place too expensive to be casual but too small to escape. When I arrived, she was already seated, accompanied by someone I hadn't seen in almost 10 years. Matthew, half-brother, her son with my father. Starched shirt, watch gleaming on his wrist, and that half-smile he always wore when he wanted to seem friendly, but was actually ready to stab you in the back. "Danny," he said, opening his arms as if no time had passed. "I'm so sorry about your father, truly." I didn't answer, I just sat down. Cynthia took a deep breath as if trying to be diplomatic. "The will be read tomorrow, but there are a few details you might prefer to settle beforehand to avoid unnecessary embarrassment." The word embarrassment hung in the air like smoke. "Look," she continued, adjusting her pearl necklace, "your father left specific instructions, but some interpretations can be flexible as long as we cooperate with each other. It was blackmail disguised as kindness." "You've been away for so long, Daniel," Matthew interjected. "It's natural that some things have changed, and it would be unfair to you as well, to arrive without knowing everything." "Without knowing what?" I asked, without changing my tone. He smiled, leaning forward. "There are clauses. Annexes, situations that require mutual trust." Cynthia placed a white envelope on the table. It wasn't the same one my wife had given me. It was a different one, sealed, with the initials WH handwritten on it. "You can open it now or tomorrow in front of the lawyer. But," she added, "if you decide today, we have a proposal that will save you unnecessary exposure. You avoid legal complications and emotional strain. And we guarantee that your name will be cleared in every way." Silence. It was as if everything had been rehearsed. They weren't there to remember my father. They were there to protect what they believed was theirs, and to prevent anything from getting out of control. "Your father trusted you," Cynthia said, looking directly into my eyes. "But he also knew about the resentments. He wanted peace, not scandal." Matthew closed the trap. "If you accept, we'll sign today before noon. After that, it'll be whatever is written." They knew something, and that made them too calm. The envelope on the table was more than just a piece of paper. It was a rigged game. And for the first time in years, I saw myself again as that boy on the porch step, holding a gift that no one wanted to give. But now, I had to decide whether to open the box, or let the story be written without me. Cynthia's voice sounded colder as she said goodbye. "Think about it, Daniel. Some doors, once they open, they never close again." They left with light steps, like people who carry no weight. But I stood there alone with 2 envelopes in my hands, and the strange certainty that none of them came about by chance. I went back home without opening either of the envelopes. I placed them on the dresser side by side. As if one were waiting for the other to explode first, I stood there, staring at that piece of paper which, for some reason, carried more weight than a coffin. And perhaps it really was a type of death. For the next 3 days I didn't go to the workshop. Not because I lacked customers, but because my hands were shaking so much that I dropped a screwdriver 3 times in a row. Claire tried to reach me. She really tried. On the first day, she asked if I wanted to talk. On the second, she sat with me on the sofa in silence. On the third, she already had her bags packed. "You won't let me in, Daniel. Not even when everything is falling apart." I didn't ask her to stay, and that was the problem. She left in the late afternoon, taking only what was hers, and taking with her everything that still kept me grounded. The house suddenly seemed bigger and cold. It wasn't just her absence, it was the echo of what I wasn't able to contain. I tried to eat that night. 2 bites, the food went down like a rock. I tried to sleep, I tossed and turned until I realized it was dawn. I got up and sat on the edge of the bed. I stared at the floor for too long. When I looked up, I saw the envelope, the one my wife gave me before she left. The same one I still haven't opened. The hand hesitated, but his weight seemed to grow with each passing day. Not because of the content, but because of what it said about me, even without being read. I sat in the chair on the porch, the same one where my grandmother used to give me weak coffee when I was a kid. The envelope was on my lap. The morning light shone softly through the silence. There, for the first time in years, I allowed myself to miss my father. Not because of the figure he was, but because of the void he left behind. The real loss wasn't his. It was realizing that, until the very end, he didn't try to get to know me. Not even in his will, not even with time running against him. It was a signed absence acknowledged in a notary's office. His silence transformed into a clause. Claire. She gave me what hurt the most, the choice to stay or to leave, and I, afraid to show the wound, let her go. Perhaps she left because she understood before I did that I was trapped in something that already controlled me. That night, it rained heavily. I got out of bed at 3 in the morning. My shirt stuck to my chest from sweating. I went down to the garage and searched among the old tools for that old wrench. My grandmother still kept in a red box with her name written on it in worn-out adhesive tape. I held onto it as if I could fix more than just hinges, as if I could go back in time, find a point where everything went off track. But there was no going back. Claire wasn't coming back. My father wouldn't come back, and I was no longer the one who pretended to be whole. The envelope was on the table, still sealed, still waiting. I took a deep breath, and for the first time I knew what I needed to do, not out of revenge nor out of anger, but because silence was no longer protecting me. I was thinking, I wasn't going to run away from it, not even from that reading, not even of what they wanted to hide. It was time to open what had been left for me, even if what was inside was just confirmation of what had always hurt. The room was cold, sterile, functional. 4 dark leather chairs, a rectangular table, and a filing cabinet that looked like it had never been rearranged. The clock on the wall read 9:57. I arrived 5 minutes early, as I always did when something mattered to me. Even if I didn't know exactly what I was about to lose, the lawyer was already there. Mr. Callahan. Gray suit, neutral gaze, restrained voice. One of those men who seemed to have rehearsed every word so as not to let a single syllable of emotion escape. Mr. Whitmore, he said without standing. Thank you for attending. I nodded. There wasn't much to say. I sat in the chair opposite. There was a folder on the table, thick, brown, and in the upper right corner, held in place by a metal clip, was the same name that had been written on the envelope Cynthia had left, W.H. The silence was thick until the door opened. Cynthia entered first. Firm face, dark dress. Discreet but expensive jewelry. Matthew came right behind him with that same smile he never learned to hide, the smile of someone who believes he has already won. I'm sorry for the delay, Cynthia said. Callahan didn't answer. He just pointed to the remaining seats. They sat down. Matthew gave me a quick sideways glance. Good to see you here, Danny. I ignored it. Callahan opened the folder, flipping through some papers, organizing the reading as if he were building a stun grenade, and knew exactly when to pull the trigger. Before we read the main provisions, it is necessary to clarify that this will is an updated version, signed irrevocably 3 weeks before the death of Mr. William H. Whitmore. Cynthia crossed her legs, but her fingers lightly pinched the fabric of her skirt. Matthew leaned forward but said nothing. Callahan continued. There are attached clauses, handwritten instructions, and a personal letter, which must be read in its entirety as part of the process. The reading will be done continuously, in the presence of all those involved. He then pulled an envelope sealed with red wax from inside the folder, the same one I had refused to open days before, the same one that now, ironically, could only be opened in front of them. When Callahan placed the envelope on the table, I noticed Cynthia's gaze shift for a second, quick. But enough. Matthew, on the other hand, viewed it as someone who had already read it, or thought he knew what was inside. Callahan scanned the room. Everyone is aware that the content of this reading has immediate legal effects. Attendance signatures are required before the opening. We signed one by one. No comments, no smiles. When he gathered the papers, he took a deep breath. For the first time since I entered that room, I noticed something different in his tone. It wasn't hesitation, it was caution. He rested his hand on the envelope. He looked directly at me, then at Cynthia, and finally at Matthew. The following text contains provisions that may alter each person's understanding of their role in this family. The silence weighed heavily, even breathing became tense. Callahan then broke the seal on the letter. The sound of the paper being opened seemed louder than it should have been. He adjusted his glasses, read silently for a few seconds, and only then did he begin to speak. But before the first word left his mouth, I knew. Something inside that room was about to change forever. Perhaps the truth was never about who would inherit what, but about who could endure listening until the end. Callahan cleared his throat once before beginning to read. This is the final and irrevocable disposition of my assets, written in full awareness and freedom of will. I, William H. Whitmore, declare that any and all assets under my ownership, including property holdings, insurance policies, bank accounts, and physical assets, shall be managed in accordance with the following conditions. Matthew adjusted his body in the chair, leaning forward. Cynthia kept her face still, but her fingers, previously intertwined in her lap, began to move slowly. I declare, firstly, that I revoke all previous wills. Matthew blinked slowly, as if he had just heard something that didn't exist in the version he knew. Callahan continued, I further declare that after long reflection, I leave full control of the family property, including the main house and the attached workshop, to Daniel Whitmore. Absolute silence. Cynthia didn't look at me, she just stood there motionless. Matthew let out a forced sigh as if he had choked on his own saliva. Furthermore, all remaining net proceeds after applicable tax deductions will be allocated to the creation of a community education fund in the name of Eileen Harris, my former mother-in-law, in recognition of her moral integrity, and for doing for my son what I was unable to do. My chest tightened when I heard my grandmother's name in that context. Her name echoed like an elegant slap in the face. Matthew, however, did not hide it. "Is this a joke?" he said, chuckling briefly. Callahan ignored him. "Matthew Whitmore, my son by blood but not by marriage, will receive a fixed, predefined sum in a restricted account, to be released subject to legal supervision and annual accounting." "Restricted?" he repeated, turning to his mother. "Is he treating me like a minor? Cynthia Whitmore, my wife at the time of my death, will receive the personal movable property already in her possession. There are no additional provisions in her name." This time she looked, not for me, but directly for Callahan. "That's not legally possible. There are contracts. There's a history. There's evidence." Callahan maintained a firm tone. "There are attachments, Ms. Whitmore. Supplementary instructions signed, everything will be filed. If there is a dispute, the process will follow legal channels. The environment has changed." That superficial calm that underpinned the scene collapsed in seconds. Matthew stood up from his chair. "You knew this, didn't you?" he said to me. "That's why he came back. You manipulated this will, you convinced him when he was sick. That's undue influence." Callahan intervened without raising his voice. "Mr. Whitmore Sr. was in full mental capacity. There are recordings, reports, and witnesses. Everything has been validated. This is going to court," Cynthia said, standing up. Her voice didn't tremble, but her eyes were different, more empty, less confident. "If this interpretation is maintained, you are telling the world that a legitimate son and a wife were abandoned because of an unresolved resentment." I took a deep breath, still sitting, still silent. "Or," said Callahan, placing the original letter on the table, "we are saying that this time Mr. Whitmore chose to act according to what he should and not according to what seemed right in the eyes of others." Matthew walked over to me. "You're going to pay for this. I'm going to drag you with this will all the way to the highest court in this state." He leaned in, almost growling. "You think you've won, but you have no idea what we can do with it." I finally looked at him. I said nothing. It wasn't necessary. Callahan then gathered the documents, placed them in a folder marked with the date of reading, and said, with the same neutrality as before, "Considering the recorded verbal threats and the direct contestation by the parties, the process will be formally forwarded to the court for recognition and validation of the testamentary will." Cynthia picked up her bag. Matthew left before her. I was the last one left. Before leaving the room, I looked at that folder one last time, and I knew that nothing had been resolved there. In fact, everything was just beginning. The hallway leading to the courtroom seemed longer than it was. A worn carpet lined the path to the dark wooden double doors to the left. Benches occupied by faces I didn't recognize, but who seemed to know too much about me. To the right, local journalists with their notebooks in their laps and eyes hungry for any sign of scandal. I entered silently, alongside my lawyer, a calm, straightforward man who never smiled out of turn, the kind who doesn't waste words when he knows that what's at stake isn't an argument but reputation. Cynthia was already there, dressed soberly, as if she wanted to project an image of dignity. Matthew too. The same blazer he wore to the funeral, the same look that was no longer hidden, it was pure, unfeigned contempt. The judge entered at exactly 10 a.m. hammer. Silence beginning. "We are here to assess the validity and enforceability of the will left by William H. Whitmore, contested by the plaintiffs Mrs. Cynthia Whitmore and Mr. Matthew Whitmore, on allegations of undue influence, bad faith, and manipulation of a legal document." The words sounded neutral coming from the judge, but they cut deep. Cynthia was the first to be called. "What we allege, Your Honor, is that Mr. Daniel Whitmore, estranged from the family for decades, reappeared at a time of vulnerability for the deceased, gaining privileged access, and, we believe, manipulating the contents of the original will." I felt their eyes turn to me, not one by one. "All at the same time," Matthew added. "My father was ill, he was weak. This sudden change of heart, excluding his wife, limiting his legitimate son, and rewarding someone who voluntarily distanced himself from the family, doesn't reflect who he really was." They used the right words. Influence, legacy, consistency, but the subtext was clearer. He was never part of this. How dare he be here? My lawyer was direct when he had the floor. We present as evidence the video of the signing recorded in an office with witnesses present, a medical report attesting to full cognitive capacity at the time of the decision, and a handwritten letter from William H. Whitmore himself justifying his choice in personal and moral terms. The envelope appeared on the table. Red folder clear label WH. Final. Everyone stared at him as if he were alive. The judge asked for silence. He asked for time to read the letter. She leafed through it slowly. She read with her eyes, not her mouth. The room felt heavy. Matthew broke the silence. That man here, pointing at me, spent his whole life distant. He never wanted to know about anyone. Do you think it's fair that he comes back now and takes everything? Just because our father had a crisis of conscience near the end? The judge looked up. Justice is not made of shared time. It is made of proven truth. He turned to me for the first time. Mr. Whitmore, would you like to comment? I got up slowly. There was no anger in my voice, only firmness. I didn't come back to get anything. I came back because he called, and because for the first time he didn't speak to me as his heir, but as a son. I sat down. Silence. One of the journalists quickly scribbled something. The prosecution insisted. The will has been manipulated. This letter may have been dictated. There are inconsistencies in the dates. There are exclusion clauses that are incompatible with previous versions. My lawyer responded with further evidence. A short video recording William sitting down, speaking clearly, naming everything. At the end of the video, he says, "This time I want to make sure everything is right. I want her to stay with someone who has never asked anything of me." The recording was watched in silence. When it was over, nobody moved for a few seconds. The judge took a deep breath. This court does not reward appearances, it rewards intention backed by evidence. Matthew stood up abruptly. This can't stay like this. He doesn't deserve this. This isn't like him. The judge raised his voice for the first time. Mr. Whitmore here. What you deserve or don't deserve isn't decided by resentment, it's decided by law. Cynthia remained seated, but her eyes were red. Not from pain, from contained fury. The judge then leaned back. He said he would decide soon. The hearing was suspended for a few minutes. Nobody said anything. Not even the journalists. Everyone was waiting. The sentence was not read in a solemn tone. There was no hammering nor any explosive reactions. The judge simply took a deep breath, adjusted his glasses, and said, "The validity of the will is confirmed. The provisions remain in effect." And with that, everything was resolved. On paper. The exit from the courthouse was slow. Not because of delay, but because of wait. Cynthia left first. She didn't speak to anyone. The sound of her heels clicking on the floor seemed shorter, as if they carried less certainty than when she entered. Matthew remained seated for a while, staring at the floor, his jaw clenched. Then he stood up, crossed the hallway without looking at me. His name had already been in the newspapers that morning. A short article, a local column, but enough to make the world around them begin to change. I saw a woman in the front seat whisper something to her husband as he drove by. No one greeted him. No one reached out a hand. Their reputation wasn't destroyed. It just became someone to avoid. And that, for people like them, was the worst kind of ruin. I was the last one to leave. The sun was shining directly in my eyes when I stepped onto the sidewalk. I felt no relief. I didn't feel angry. I felt a tiredness that didn't come from my body. It came from a part of me that always believed that if I stayed far enough away, none of this would reach me. Outside, my lawyer shook my hand. I didn't say congratulations. He simply said, "Now the aftermath begins." On the way home, the radio was turned off. I was driving as if I were relearning how to get around that city. Every corner seemed smaller, each street quieter. The next day, I received the deed to the property, the house where I grew up, the workshop in the back, signed with my name. But it didn't seem like an achievement to me. It seemed like an outstanding deal finally delivered. I spent hours standing in the back shed, the same place where I learned to fix things with my grandmother's wrench. Now everything there seemed motionless, as if he had waited for me for too long. I found one of my father's former employees in there, Tom, an old, loyal mechanic who stayed until the very end. He looked at me as if he was still trying to figure out what to do with the new presents. But after a while, he said, his father didn't talk much. But in the last few months, he would stop by here. He would sit on this bench. He would look at his photos on the board in the workshop. I didn't answer. It wasn't necessary. The pain was already enough. I went back home. I opened the drawer where the envelope Claire gave me was still kept, sealed. She didn't come back. He didn't call. And part of me understands. She saw everything before I did, and it gave me time in which I didn't know how to use. I opened the envelope for the first time. Inside there was only one leaf, a sentence handwritten in her firm handwriting. "You always fixed everything. Accept what you felt. I folded the paper carefully. I put it back. I didn't cry. But for the first time, I let the silence pass through me defenseless. All around, everything seemed resolved. But inside, there was still something to settle. I lost more than I gained. I got more than I asked for. And perhaps this is how justice reveals itself when it arrives too late. Not like peace, but as a divided burden. At the end of that week, I entered alone into the house where I spent half my childhood trying to be invisible. The walls were exactly as I remembered them, only smaller. The hallway that once seemed endless now fit in 3 steps. In the master bedroom closet, the hangers still bore the imprints of the suits he used to wear. The dresser drawer was locked. I found the key in the small wooden box next to a framed photograph. It was an old picture of me and my grandmother. I must have been about 7 years old. We were sitting in the workshop. She was smiling. I wasn't. Inside the drawer were old receipts, letters never sent, a stopped clock, and a black notebook. The notebook was full of short notes, some dates, names, and on a single page in the middle, just one sentence. It's not too late to try to fix it, but it might be too late to deliver it fixed. I closed the notebook. I put it away. I spent the rest of the day cleaning the shed in the back, not out of necessity, but out of symbolism. I swept the floor, rearranged the tools, and put the old wrench back on the hook on the wall. It was rusty at the edges, but it still served its purpose. Later, I hung a small frame at the entrance to the workshop. In it, I had written the name that was never included in a will, but which sustained everything that made me resist. Eileen's Garage. Not as a public tribute, but for the sake of inner justice. I haven't heard from Cynthia since. I learned from others that she has moved away from the city. Matthew tried to appeal, but the case was closed without reversal. The last time I saw him, he walked right past me without stopping. There was no confrontation, only a silence that incredibly sounded all too familiar. Claire didn't come back, and I didn't go after it. Not out of pride, but because now I understand that there are absences that shouldn't be filled by force. Her role in my story was genuine, but it also came to an end. Today, the workshop is open for business. Slowly, at the right pace. Some longtime residents started bringing their cars. Tom still shows up sometimes just to ask if I need anything. Gradually, the sounds of the workshop began to fill the space again. Home again. It will take even longer for this one to stop looking like a ghost town. Every now and then, I still pick up Claire's letter. I read slowly. I double it with the same care. I watch. Not to feed the pain, but to remind myself of what I can no longer postpone. Justice was served, but not as a victory. She came as a kind of cleaner silence, a type of space where I can finally breathe. And perhaps that's it. We can't overcome certain things. We only stop carrying on as if we needed to win. I didn't feel victorious, but I felt free, and for the first time whole enough to continue. Some people inherit wealth, others inherit only the burden, and the choice not to pass it on.